Welcome back to Harbour Unboxed. We are once again in the hotel lobby at their little restaurant here filming our Q&A series. It's been very pleasant.
It's been quiet, it's been nice. I get a nice view of the skyscrapers that you're not seeing from this angle, but that angle's quite nice as well.
The view out there is really cool. Last year we did it on the rooftop garden. We'll be doing that again this year, except the days predating this were extremely hot. Today, temperature-wise, it's lovely outside, but it's raining and windy, so
not ideal.
Here we are having some drinks and answering your questions. But before we do, this coverage is brought to you by MSI, Thermal Grizzly, G-Skill and Trix. Check out MSI's range of Z890 and B860 motherboards built for performance with robust VRAM designs that are cooled by massive heat sinks. There's more than enough power delivery to support the latest Core Ultra desktop processors from Intel. Also enjoy ultra-fast networking, Wi-Fi 7 and at least 5 gigabit wired LAN. There's also support for PCIe 5.0 along with MSI's screwless M.2 Shield Frozer for quick and easy installation of storage. Learn more about MSI's range of Z890 and B860 motherboards via the links in the video description. Also supporting our Computex trip this year is Thermal Grizzly and their Duranaut high-performance thermal paste offering extreme long-term stability combined with outstanding thermal conductivity. It's not electrically conductive and won't harden over time, so for more information please check the links in the video description.
So, is the MSRP just a flat-out lie? Pretty simple question, that one.
Depends on the product.
Yep.
Is it a flat-out lie? I mean, in the case of the 9070 XT, to this point in time, yeah, because they had to subsidize it for it to be real, so it was never intended to be $600 US, for example. We've spoke about this before in other content. We've since heard that it was planned to be at least $650. Some people have told us it was going to be announced to be $700 at CES. Not sure, but they obviously wanted more. 2 months later, Tim's made a video on it that the MSRP hasn't been real. But then we're also hearing that supply is going to ramp up, and later in the around the time that Nvidia releases the Super Series, we're expecting cards to hit the MSRP. So if they do it towards the end of this year, then for at least half of the product's life, it would have been MSRP, probably a little bit over that, right?
Yeah.
And then it may dip below the MSRP sometime next year.
And also added to that, I guess, some people were able to buy one at the MSRP for a limited time. So I guess it depends, like, what do you mean by a lie? Like, if you sell some cards at the MSRP, it kind of isn't a lie, but then most people would interpret it to be at least very misleading.
It's very misleading, yeah.
So, like, lie, I always think of lie as quite a strong word to use. Like, lie basically has to be, you know, completely inaccurate, false, which again, it's like, it is largely false, but there's like a technicality that makes it true. Yeah,
and it's also too early to make that call one way or the other anyway, because you have to get to the end of the product cycle. And so again, if it's sold for the first 12 months above MSRP, and then it was at or below MSRP for the consecutive 12 months, and it's like, well, a lot of people...
It's bad, but not...
Yeah. And again, it's a supply and demand thing as well. So let's say that it wasn't a lie, right? Let's say that AMD had enabled the MSRP, they'd shipped a reasonable volume of cards, but the demand still outweighed the supply, and whether it be the board partners, the distributors, because it's usually the distributors that are the bad guys here, or the end retailer, which generally isn't them, but they cop the flack. If any one link in that chain jacks the price up, they're above MSRP, and they don't sit on shelves because demand is outweighing supply. So that's why historically, even when the demand was nothing like what we see today, early on, it was difficult to get a card because for the first few weeks they were just all sold out. We didn't really see them selling above MSRP because there wasn't, I mean, there were certainly some cases, but it wasn't widespread because there just wasn't enough time to adjust pricing because the stock wasn't there. And then by the time, you know, following batches of supply came in, then the demand leveled off and, you know, they sold at the price, but they sat on shelves a bit longer than they would at this point in time. So basically, talking to the AIBs with stuff like 9070 XTs, they're really able to sell everything they can make, and therefore we've heard partners who they're loving it, like they are jacking up the prices. So they've admitted as much to us, which you wouldn't expect, but they've basically told us like they can charge more, so they are.
Yeah, I mean, it's market supply and demand factors, so just the market is what it is, and also playing the game. Like, everyone's doing it, and while we're not happy about that situation, we would like that on the day you can just go and buy cards at the MSRP. There are all sorts of factors going into this that make it very complicated. So we always need to be very reasonable when we talk about, like, is pricing real or fake? And we need to make sure, and I think it has been reasonable throughout graphics cards over time, that we need to give companies some fair amount of time to produce enough cards that they can hit the MSRP, so that they can avoid the sort of market factor side of things where, as you sort of said, you know, at the start, everyone wants the cards. Everyone wants the cards for a period of time, and so they're not going to be able to make enough to meet that demand. So whether or not that's like, is it acceptable within 2 months, 3 months, or 1 month? Who knows? And we might have to reassess those sorts of things if PC gaming becomes much more popular. If there's much more demand than expected, then, you know, we can't really expect companies to just like lose money on cards or not go for the profits that they want, because they're profit-driven companies. If there's, you know, a lack of supply, they're going to increase the prices. This isn't a surprising thing. We're not going to ask companies to just, like, you know, force the prices or whatever. So I think with this generation, the cards that have probably been the worst, the least real MSRPs, has been the 9070 XT along with the RTX 5080 and 5090. Those three cards have probably been the worst in terms of length of time where cards have been unavailable at the MSRP. The 5090 today is still really not a thing. It's in fact very hard to buy in general and very expensive. The 5080 is improving slightly, but still not to the level of MSRP in most regions. And the 9070 XT that we've obviously talked about, I think manufacturers, board partners, they're trying to make as many cards as possible. The other models, depends on the regions a bit there. 5070, quite widely available at the right price. Oh, Steve's getting another drink.
I'm getting a special drink here. I see Balin got the exact same drink for himself.
It actually looks pretty sweet, so that looks nice. And sweet, I mean, it's good.
Yeah.
Anyway, so yeah, 5070, quite widely available at the MSRP in a lot of regions. 5070 Ti, there was obviously a lot of panic about that card being $900. It remains expensive in the US, but in other regions it's basically at the MSRP now. 5060 series we've been talking about, that has been, demand hasn't been super high in the DIY market. Cards seem to be readily available. I'm saying this all with the disclaimer that this is outside the US. In the US, with tariff and those sorts of effects, the MSRP is going to be virtually impossible to hit, and that's understandable. So we're not going to be claiming like, yes, 5070 should be $550 in the US when they have to pay 30% or whatever the current tariffs are. I've got no idea what they are now. So yeah, that's the current situation. Product by product sort of basis, and we'll have to just wait and see with upcoming products like the 9060 XT. I think what is going to help the 9060 XT is we've heard that the internal price targets from AMD are much closer to the price that they've announced. With the 9070 XT, as we were talking about, the price they wanted to hit and were talking about before launch was higher than what they ended up going with, and so a lot of price corrections needed to happen. With the 9060 XT, it seems like it's more of an in the range sort of thing. So whether or not that will actually help, I'm not sure. I still expect demand will be high, prices will be high as a result, but fingers crossed we see that resolve itself throughout the rest of this year.
Okay, that caramel coffee is delicious. Just wanted to officially get that out there, and Balin's thoroughly enjoying his by the look on his face.
Yeah.
So, after meeting many AIBs and essentially the do-it-yourself industry at Computex, what are the sentiments from AIBs in regards to Nvidia's latest shenanigans? And in contrast, how do they view AMD? Hit us with the shenanigans, Tim.
Well, like we were sort of talking about earlier with the whole 8GB situation, AIBs aren't exactly upset about that sort of 8GB situation because they know they'll be selling boatloads of those cards to, you know, the pre-built markets essentially. And when it comes to like review issues with like publishing of, you know, the reviews of the 5060 and that sort of thing, they don't really care. Like, let's be honest, it's not really their wheelhouse. They're just interested in selling products. So we've heard from people who obviously like, that was a surprise that happened. Sorry that you guys are having to deal with that sort of thing, but they're largely just focused on making the graphics cards. That said, you know, the sentiment towards Nvidia, and I think Gamers Nexus alluded to that in their, you know, post on their community tab talking about their investigation. They're not exactly known to have a great reputation with board partners and various companies in the industry. You know, there's a lot of of interesting things that will potentially come out in those sorts of investigations as to, the relationship between Nvidia and board partners. You would have seen that with EVGA as an example, where they basically said when they left the industry that it was because of how difficult it was to work with Nvidia, and you can imagine that other board partners are having similar struggles. So I think they're more concerned with that side of things, not like the 5060 review program or 8GB cards. They just want Nvidia to make it a bit easier for them.
Yeah, the marketing guys were certainly frustrated. I don't know if I can speak for the entire company that's involved in this situation, but we were sent multiple different RTX 5060 samples like weeks ago, well before we came to Computex, and they were hoping for some exposure there. So, we often feature multiple cards in our day one reviews, let you guys know how they perform thermally. We provide a lot of nice product shots and stuff like that, which is what they're expecting to get. So, various brands, they were expecting their cars to be featured in our review, talked about, and they get a bit of brand presence and all that sort of stuff. And it's not just our reviews, it's the ones all around the world there. So they missed out on that, and they were pretty frustrated by it and just didn't understand why Nvidia were going about things the way they were.
Yeah, it's been interesting talking to some companies that don't directly make graphics cards as well. So all the peripheral manufacturers, cases, storage, all that sort of thing, they do thrive on Nvidia graphics card launches because it generates so much industry and PC building. A lot of people upgrade their graphics card and then they throw in a whole bunch of other components that they might be interested in upgrading, or they just build an entirely new PC at that point. So a lot of those companies, they time their releases for their new cases or power supplies or whatever with Nvidia GPUs. And so if Nvidia GPUs in general are poor or not as interesting for buyers, then that hurts them because they're not being able to sell as many keyboards or cases or whatever than they were expecting.
And we did see a lot of very affordable cases that are probably something you would pair with a new system build or an upgrade with a 5060, so there's probably no coincidence there that they were hoping that'd generate a bit of hype and get people excited about PC building and all that sort of stuff.
So yeah, that's been a bit of a pain point for some of these companies. I think a lot of them are obviously as well struggling with the tariff situation, which is kind of separate to the whole Nvidia GPU side of things. So there's, vibes that some companies weren't necessarily the highest at this Computex as maybe there has been in previous times when launches have been really positive. I wouldn't say everything's been bad. Like, companies have been very excited to show off their latest products, but if you ask them questions about the industry as a whole, a lot of we were sort of hoping for a better market to be releasing these products into. We're hoping the economy to be better, tariffs to be lower, and more excitement in the PC gaming industry. And so, there's obviously been sentiment about, these launches hurting gaming in that sense. But then, this question was also asking the comparison to AMD. And while AMD GPUs have been, successful and popular so far, partners involved with AMD aren't exactly happy with the way AMD's approached these things historically either, and even with these current launches, largely because AMD chops and changes a lot with some of their the internal messaging to AIBs. That's what we've sort of been learning over the last year or so, and has been reinforced at this Computex is, they don't have very consistent messaging. They're changing things, changing prices, doing things last minute, not giving clear instructions to board partners that kind of need that information in advance so that they can create the products and sort of set up their lineup. So, certain partners want pricing information ahead of time so that they don't accidentally make a high-end model for a series that doesn't really justify a high-end model. Like, if they drop the price at the last minute and suddenly, a $900 9070 XT no longer makes any sense, then they've put all that effort into designing a card that's ultimately not going to sell. And so that AMD partners are also frustrated from that side of things. So it's not like Nvidia's stuffing up, therefore all the AMD partners are super happy. It's a little bit of a mixture of both. And obviously we've heard from some of the companies that have historically made both Nvidia and AMD GPUs that the AMD division can end up costing them money with these decisions, like actually operating at a loss overall, compared to Nvidia, where their GeForce division will be making money. And so that's been frustrating for them. So, you'd be sitting here saying like, 9070 XT, surely the AIBs were happy. And I was certainly going into some of those discussions thinking that they would be like over the moon wrapped, but it's been the confusing messaging, and also, they were saying like we want 10x the number of AMD GPUs because we think we would be able to sell that, and the supply just isn't there right now. Yeah,
they're certainly much happier with RDNA 4 so far though compared to RDNA 3. There was a lot of frustrations we were hearing with RDNA 3, and it was really interesting because it was very similar, or the same frustrations we had. The 9070 XT, for example, in our review.
7900 XT.
Sorry, the 7900 XT.
Yeah.
That came up quite a lot in conversation. You know, people, a lot of the AIBs we were talking to were basically saying it should have never been $900. They had a lot of those cards ready to sell. AMD basically killed that out of the gate. And then when the price did get dropped and it was a really good value product, it didn't sell in the numbers it should have, and the demand and the hype wasn't there. But they learnt that for the 9070 XT. Maybe last minute they learnt it, but they got it right in the end.
Yeah, they did. So, yeah, I mean, it's always interesting having industry chats here at Computex and sort of getting a feel for how things are going. Yeah, I think with those AMD partners, it has flipped from more of a loss situation to a profit situation with this generation, which is obviously great for them. With Nvidia, they tend to make money because of the volume side of things. But yeah, the industry could be better, but I think we've still seen a lot of really interesting products across all sorts of ranges. Monitors have been really strong this year at Computex. So while there might not be as much interest in them, companies are still pumping out very exciting products and dialing back on the AI BS, so that helps a bit as well, in my opinion. Intel GPUs, when will they drop?
Yeah, not sure. I'm still seeing the rumors of the B770. I think we spoke about this on the podcast.
Yeah, there were rumors that it would launch at Computex because Nvidia, the Intel Twitter account, X account or whatever, was replying to people being like, stay tuned for a B770 announcement, but obviously that didn't happen. It was largely professional cards that were announced at the show. Yeah,
on the podcast we said we weren't expecting any new Intel consumer gamer grade GPUs to be launched, and that appears to have been the case now. So yeah, no GPUs from Intel. B770, haven't heard anything about it. I've got no information for you. Basically what I said on the podcast was, for this generation, I just don't think they can release a B770 due to that CPU overhead issue. Now, it affects these GPUs to varying degrees, but the more powerful you make the GPU, the more powerful the CPU needs to be. So, based on what I've seen with the B580, I believe if a B770 was to ever exist, you would really need quite a high-end CPU for it to stack up well with the competing GeForce and Radeon GPUs in a lot of those titles that show the overhead issue. Now, maybe later in the year they can address that issue and that'll make the B770 a viable option. I don't know, but as things stand right now, I don't really see how they can make that product. For me, that's the biggest issue there, is the overhead thing needs to be addressed before they can make a more powerful GPU. Because a more powerful GPU, while it does enable higher levels of graphic fidelity, generally people are buying them for higher frame rates. And the B580 is more like your 60 FPS card, whereas the B770 may push into the well over 100. And that's where we really started to see the problems of the B580 in games like Spider-Man, for example. If you lowered the resolution and visual quality settings to enable a higher refresh rate experience, when you did so with a lower end CPU, it really just fell flat on its face, whereas the GeForce and Radeon GPUs push forward with much higher frame rates. So that's, in my mind, the number one reason that's preventing them from doing that.
I think the only way we would see it, with all that knowledge in mind, is that they might have already produced the GPU dies, and so they might come to a point where they run the numbers and they're like, well, we could sell this silicon for X amount of money and that would be better than losing money and just throwing the silicon away. That is, of course, if they have made those larger GPU dies, which is unclear whether they have. It seems like they have made some sample silicon, but whether or not it ever went into mass production, I'm not sure. Yep. So my guess would be that the card would, if it never went into mass production, the GPU die, and they're thinking, should they or should they not put it into mass production? I think they ultimately will decide not to, especially because if the rumors are now suggesting a launch later in the year, the newer Radeon and GeForce GPUs are going to be more widely available. They're going to be closer to the MSRP, fingers crossed.
Hard market to compete.
It's going to be much harder to compete in. Whereas when the B580 launched, which is really when the B770 should have launched if they were going to do that, it was in a position where the next generation Radeon, GeForce lower end cards were at least 5 to 6 months away, which ended up being the case. So that at least allowed them 5 to 6 months of runway, which they still fumbled because they couldn't make enough of the products and all that sort of thing. But that was the opportunity. Launching it closer to Super Series products and wide availability of Radeon cards just isn't going to be, yeah, they have to make it cheaper than maybe they're expecting, sell it at a loss. So I don't know, I find it hard to think that card will come out, but hopefully they can obviously learn from this and improve the products for next generation. So then if it comes to launching like a C7 class sort of product, they will have solved some of these issues and it will be much more viable. How does the team feel about the ATX case market as a whole? Other than the Silverstone Retro case and the Corsair thing with the separate AIO compartment, I'm not really seeing any innovative stuff. Apart from maybe Thermaltake and one or two others, it seems like we're currently in a phase of sticking more screens and more RGB into existing designs rather than coming up with genuinely interesting and new stuff. I mean, yeah, that's cases. Cases are boring. Like, I'm going to be totally honest with you. Like, what can you, like, how many variations of a squarish sort of thing can you make? Like, there seems to be like they'll do a fish tank design now, every once in a while they'll come up with something like that, but
yeah, I tend to agree. At the same time, probably not as harsh. They're like,
sorry Gamers Nexus, but yeah, I'd rather test monitors.
There have certainly been some great unique case designs and stuff that, you know, I've been quite impressed with when I see them. I do enjoy checking out the new cases when they come my way for builds and stuff like that, so that's a bit of fun. But I think more what you're saying is cases are so good at being cases now.
Yeah.
And they have been for a long time. That
there's so many options, they're so cheap, there's something for everyone already on the market. They're like, what else are they going to do?
Yeah, what you're saying is, at no point in time over the last 5 years, let's say, have you been sitting there faced with a new system build and been like, oh, if only there was a case that was for me or did this certain thing.
100%.
Or, you're like, okay, I want a white case. I want it in this form factor. I'd like it to have these features. You're like, okay, so I've narrowed it down to 50 options.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of case options and a lot of great cases. So we're not sitting here in desperate need of a case to do a certain thing. It's cool when, you know, some sort of innovation comes along and you're like, wow, I didn't know I needed this in my life, or that's a cool thing. That's nice, but yeah, not sitting there like we are with GPUs thinking, hey, it'd be great if GPUs did this and were available at this price or available at the advertised price, and you know, it'd be good if we had more variety of, I don't know, CPUs or something like that. And
it's a mass market product now. There are so many of them, so many options. It's a commodity, and so
it's been well refined. There's plenty of great options, so that's that.
Have you been able to talk to any vendors about AMD's next CPU and if it will be on AM5? Tim has said he has his doubts. I think it's firming more towards that Zen 6 will be on AM5, just from speaking to various people in the industry. While AMD still hasn't confirmed and committed to that, which I would very much like to see just to remove ambiguity. I think that would improve, or at least allow people to buy into the AM5 platform, knowing that there will be a future CPU on that platform. But I think it's like 90 to 95% likely that Zen 6 will be on AM5, which I think is a good position to be in. So at this point, I would be very surprised if it wasn't.
Yeah, well, that's been my opinion from the start, but I've certainly understood your hesitation there because it's a huge win for them. I guess you could say that it's not really a win they desperately need at this point in time.
No, I mean, they're smashing the CPU market. They're doing pretty much everything right, so.
Which is the problem, which is great for them, and it's great to have good CPUs, and I think overall the CPU market's quite healthy. But you are seeing a change there from when they were the underdog and struggling to compete. They were very transparent. There were lots of community posts. There was lots of stuff talking about Ryzen's development, what they're working on, and now it's a bit more radio silence on that front, and they're not having to give away as much information or act like they're the good guys, and you know, they're trying to do the right thing by the community. Now they just, yeah, it's more what you'd expect from a company, really, the way they're operating. So yeah, that's what we sort of have said all along, that would happen. They only appear to be your best buddy when they desperately need your money, but when you're buying their stuff anyway, then it's like, yeah. Finally, a big thank you to G-Skill and Trix for helping to make our Computex trip possible this year. G-Skill offers an amazing range of DDR5 memory with AMD Expo support, allowing you to get the most out of your Ryzen processor, and we've been using their Trident Z5 Neo memory in our test systems for years now, as we rely on it to get the best results. We've also started using Trix coolers, and I've got to say the Panorama SE 360 Black is one of the best looking AIOs I've ever seen. The quality of the rotatable display is incredible, and as complex as the design appears, it's remarkably quick and easy to install. So for more information, please check the links in the video description. All right, that does it for our Computex Q&A series. Of course, we'll be back next month in Australia doing the typical Q&A related stuff. Yeah, this was a nice break. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, this pretty much wraps up our Computex coverage. Like, this is the very last thing that we're filming, so I don't know whether or not we'll publish stuff after that, but it's nice to get back and just have a chat about all the stuff that we've seen, a lot of the hot topics that you guys have been talking about. So I always enjoy the Computex Q&As. It always feels like there's a lot to talk about around these shows. So thanks to everyone that's asked a question. We've got Patreon, obviously. If you're watching at this point in the video, you probably know the drill. Patreon, you get cool benefits and perks and that sort of thing. There's the other Q&A episodes you can watch as well if you're interested in more discussion. And we've got the podcast as well. We've made some podcasts here at Computex, further discussion on some of the things that have been happening around, Nvidia, AMD GPUs. We've had some chats with other creators as well. So you will have seen some or all of that on the channels.
The Hardware Box podcast. It's on YouTube. Go sign up to it. We have weekly discussions and stuff, and yeah, a lot of cool guests on. So you want to be subscribed to that as well. Go do it now.
Now, you have to. It's a requirement.
All right, Nate, you've done that. I'm your host, Steve.
I'm your host, Tim.
See you next time.